Oh, the pressure. I'm supposed to do in 25 minutes what theologians and scholars haven't done in 2,000 years. Answer that question? No, sorry. Maybe another day I'll prep it. Anyway, my name's Terry Thomas. For those that don't know me, my wife and I have been coming to Cornerstone now for almost 30 years. Be like 30 years in October, so pretty close. My assignment for this Sunday from Pastor James was to somehow stitch together something from the 5 people that were covered in this week's devotional reading from the Adam Hamilton booklet that played a role in Jesus's crucifixion. Can't do it, okay? I mean, there isn't enough information on any one of these characters, much less all 5, to try to stitch together some sort of cogent story. I mean, maybe Pontius Pilate, but even he's got limited exposure outside of the Bible. But anyway, and then I thought about, okay, what's the theme for the Sunday? And it occurred to me that one of the major passages that occurs during this time we always hear about is, Pontius Pilate, when he's interrogating Jesus, he says, well, Jesus is talking to him about his purpose and why he was born and everything like that. And he says, well, and Jesus uses the word truth. I'm the way, the light, and Pontius Pilate kind of gets in his face and says, well, what is truth? So again, one of those questions that nobody can answer, certainly not me. So I had to bag that one as well. So what I did was I thought about, okay, where can I find a resource that will do this for me? Something that I can use to kind of bring all 5 of these people who were not a gang of 5, because a gang kind of connotes a certain amount of organization and collaboration and conspiracy, if you will, because these people were, except for Pontius Pilate and his wife, these people really didn't interact that much. Anyway, but I wasn't very creative, so I just went with Gang of 5. But what I want to do is, first off, I'm going to prep us a little bit, give us a little bit of the lay of the land, which is what I like to do, because I think so much of us do not, when we read the Bible, don't understand what we're reading because we don't understand the lay of the land. And the Bible, more than any other scripture that I can think of, from other traditions, is very, very local in terms of using the land, the places, the people, the history, the politics, the geography, and telling the story. So getting an idea of where people are, what things look like, stuff like that, I think is very helpful in us understanding better what the Bible has to say. So, aerial view of probably the most contested piece of property in the entire world, okay, without doubt. This is called the Temple Mount. It's in Jerusalem, and this part of Jerusalem, you can see the wall here and goes around. It's called the Old City, and it has a Muslim quarter, a Jewish quarter, an Armenian quarter, and a Christian quarter. And you can literally, it's a culture shock to go in there, literally. But after a while, you kind of learn the lay of it, and you can say, well, I'm in the Christian quarter because it's usually the dirtiest, the Jewish quarter because it's the cleanest, and stuff like that. And anyway, what I want to do was kind of give us an idea of what was going on during these last week of Jesus, okay? And specifically, we'll get into the last day, but without going into the crucifixion. All right, so this is the Temple Mount. Now, in Jesus' day, Herod's temple, which we read of in the Bible, was really somewhere on this spot here. Today, that is what we call the Dome of the Rock, or the Haram al-Sharif, noble sanctuary, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. This is the 3rd holiest site in Islam. This is why they get all up in arms about who's going to control it and who has turf, control, stuff like that. But it's also a holy site to the Jews because that's where the temple stood. It's also a holy site to the Christians because it's part of our story. Now, obviously, the temple's not there anymore. It was destroyed. I'll get to that in a little bit. Here's what's called the Kidron Valley. You'll read that in your Bible, the Kidron Valley. It's not like, a big valley that we think of, especially up here in the Cascades, but even a hill gets called Mount something in Israel. And in fact, this is Mount Olives, the Mount of Olives, okay, which is where Jesus kind of camped out whenever he was in that vicinity. He would either be there, camped out somewhere in the mountain, hill, and or over in this area here, which is where Bethphage and Bethany were. Okay, so Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, that's kind of where they lived. But on the day that we're talking about, Jesus and his disciples would be kind of just camped out somewhere around here on the side of the hill. Typically, Jesus' ministry was centered farther up north around the Sea of Galilee, okay? So whenever he was doing most of his ministry, he was up in that area, not terribly far away, but still a bit of a walk. But whenever there was a lot of tension going on, it was usually when he was in Jerusalem. And a Jewish male was supposed to make the 3 pilgrim festivals, which happened every year. So 3 times a year, all Jewish males were supposed to book it to Jerusalem or wherever God had assigned them to go. Initially, it was the tabernacle, but then later became the temple. So he would have been there 3 times a year, no matter what. Anyway, so here we are, the Mount of Olives. Gethsemane is a bit of a misunderstood name. We have this tendency to kind of conflate or join together separate words in somebody else's language. I think one of the points that was made in one of the readings was Barabbas. We say Barabbas. Well, it's not really Barabbas, it's Barabbas. Bar in Hebrew is son. Abbas, it means, or Abba is father. So son of the Father, which is kind of a bit of a twist on words given who he was and who Jesus was. So anyway, so whenever Jesus left, he was up here on the Mount of Olives, he would go down through the Kidron Valley and then come into Jerusalem, usually on a gate that's on this eastern-facing wall. When he did the triumphal entry, okay, which happens next week, we call it Palm Sunday, he came in that way. Just another same view, just zoomed out a little bit. The reason I wanted to do this is because this area right here on the Mount of Olives is a cemetery, a Jewish cemetery. And all those tombs are above ground. So it's just like these thousands and thousands of above ground tombs and the reason they want to be there is because they're on the west-facing hillside, which makes them see the temple, which would have been right there or thereabouts, okay? It's a very weird kind of place. I got a story about it, but I don't have time to tell it today. Anyway, in Jesus' day, in the first century, that's kind of what it might have looked like, okay? And it was a very impressive structure. Herod the Great, the guy that did the baby thing when Jesus was born, was also a very prolific builder, okay? And one of the things that he did to placate the Jews was to enhance and expand the Temple Mount, okay? So here would have been the temple. This is Solomon's colonnade. This would be the western direction, and then to the east would have been the Mount of Olives, and where Jesus and them usually stayed. The interesting thing, too, is once you go over this ridge line and start going down towards the east, you go into the Rift Valley, which is where the Dead Sea is. So you're actually going to go 1,300 feet. If you go all the way down to the Dead Sea, you're going to go 1,300 feet below sea level, okay? And the Rift Valley is actually part of the larger rift between the African and the Eurasian plate. So it's that area is very seismically active. All right, here's a scale model of the temple, okay? And this would have been when he was coming in on Palm Sunday, chances are he would have come in on this side of on the Temple Mount, and there's actually a gate. This is not what it looks like now, but there's a gate there called the Lion's Gate, which has been filled in. But that would have been the likely place. So again, Solomon's colonnade. And then over on the other side of this wall, okay, just down the way, is what we know of today as the Western Wall, or some people still call it the Wailing Wall, okay? And this is kind of a typical day, people coming to pray. People along the side of the wall will pray, mill around. If you're having a bar mitzvah, that's, they'll bring the kids and everything and have a big celebration. And then people will write out prayers on pieces of paper and stuff them in between the stones, okay, in the crevices, And I've done that a couple of times myself. But that's a kind of a typical day. Now, during the day, that might swell a lot because the Orthodox Jews will come in, they get bussed in, they'll go in, pray, because it's kind of an open-air synagogue. And it's the last kind of real remnant of what was there at the time of Jesus, okay, that hasn't been messed up or torn down. Anyway, so that's a typical day, but on a holy day, that's what it looks like, okay? Now, here's the deal. Typically, Jerusalem's population was about 30,000. I mean, that's kind of what the archaeologists kind of tell us based upon, their benchmarks. Usually it's how many people can squeeze into an amphitheater, and then they multiply it by 10. Very, very crude estimate. Anyway, but on a holy day like Passover, okay, the population of Jerusalem would have swelled into the hundreds of thousands. Because again, it was obligatory for Jewish males to come to Jerusalem on those festival or pilgrim feasts. And Passover was one of the more important ones. Because that reflects back to what? We think of Passover, what does that draw us to in the Bible? Exodus, the Passover, the angel of death passing over the Israelites. They put the blood on the lintels of their door and stuff like that. So that's what Passover is all about. It's a celebration of their exodus from Egypt. So again, referring back to this, Jesus is kind of camped out up here in the Mount of Olives or staying with Martha, Mary, Lazarus up here in Bethany, Bethphage. And this is where the Western Wall is right here today. That's about the only thing left of the original Temple Mount area that hasn't been torn up or reused or something like that. So he comes in on a donkey, which is a part of a prophetic thing from Zechariah. And people are waving palm branches, all right? Now, the oddity of that is that wasn't part of what they typically did, okay? It was more of a one-off thing. It's not something they did, year after year after year, and it's not something he did after this one, okay? The palm branch was not to them a religious symbol. It was a national symbol. It referred back to a very short period of time when they were independent before the Romans came in and took over. For about 80, 90 years, Israel was an independent country. So the palm branch became part of a symbol of their independence. And the coinage that they found during this period will almost always have a palm branch and a ram's horn part of the coinage, along with the head of who was the current king or high priest or whatever. Okay, now the ram's horn, yes, it had some religious significance, but the palm branch, no, okay? It was a nationalistic, it was like the bald eagle, if you will, okay? So, even today, pilgrims, tourists, whatever, will parade through Jerusalem, around the old city with palm branches, okay? It's just kind of one of those things you do. It's kind of like on, you carry your cross. If you're going to go do the Via Dolorosa, a lot of people will have these 2x4 crosses that they can rent and drag them along. Very, very commercialized, if you will. Well, to understand what the distinction is between what they're doing and the way we think of it versus what the people on the day that Jesus rode in Jerusalem is this. This is what we would be doing today, or they would be doing, although their flags would be Israeli flags, okay? But I didn't want to upset anybody. It's basically a nationalistic symbol. It has nothing to do with their religion or anything like that. And again, in all likelihood, it was a one-off deal. This is the only time it was done. We, the church, have taken that from the text and created our own celebration, if you will, Palm Sunday. And we take the ashes from the previous Sunday's palms that have been burned, use those to make the ashes on our foreheads on the next Ash Wednesday, okay? So that's all church stuff. It's not part of the original first century Jewish religious symbol. All right, back again. Now, we go about 4 or 5 days later. So Jesus entered made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, okay? 4 or 5 days later, Jesus, he's still back up here on the Mount of Olives with his disciples. And what is he doing during that evening before he's been arrested? He's praying so hard that what comes out of his pores? Blood and sweat. Gethsemane, again, is a word that we tend to join together. Actually, is 2 separate words in Hebrew, Gethsemane, and it literally translates oil press. Now, the oil of their day was olive oil, so it was basically an olive press operation, olive production operation, okay? And so the word Gethsemane actually refers back to that. Now, today, there is a Garden of Gethsemane or a garden at Gethsemane, but in Jesus' day, there was no place called Garden of Gethsemane. I mean, it's a misappropriation of the word. There was Mount of Olives, and that's kind of the way it was. And there might have been a place called Gethsemane, but it wasn't a garden in the traditional sense. Now, in the Gospel of John, it does refer to a garden, and that's kind of where they get that misappropriation, but it's a different story altogether. And this is kind of what it looks like today, a very tranquil place. Some of these olive trees can live very, very long time, hundreds of years. I think some of the latest or the longest ones that they've been able to date anyway are probably 1,000 years old or so. And they get very gnarly, and they're not really very attractive trees. But if anybody like myself that loves olive oil, I mean, you don't care what it came from. So the soldiers, the temple guards, whoever come in the night and get Jesus, collect him, and take him to the house of the high priest, not to the temple courts, which is but to the house. I mean, the violations of all the rules, if you will, of how you prosecute somebody have been completely obliterated, okay? And in fact, the worst one was, it's clearly stated in the law of Moses that anything criminal or whatever, in fact, anything, has to be established by 2 or more witnesses. And what happens during the interrogation? They cannot get 2 people to come up with the same consistent story about Jesus, even when they're telling lies, okay? And that's usually what happens when you tell lies. You can never keep it straight. And so they collect Jesus, they take him to the home of Caiaphas or Annas, instead of the temple area, which is where it would have been done in the daytime and not at the middle of the night. And, rough him up a little bit. Now, this is kind of, kind of a Brad Pitt looking kind of guy. He looks a little roughed up, but I've been in worse fights. Looked a lot dirtier than that. But that's Hollywood. All right, so what I want to do is I'm going to show you about a 20-minute video, okay? And I'm going to have to give you a little bit of a spoiler alert. Like I said, I had to come up with something that would stitch these 5 people together in a way that made sense. And so what I did was I used a motion picture, okay? And the good news and the bad news is you don't have to listen to me anymore, okay? You're going to listen to them, but it's in foreign language, okay? So it's a mix of Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew, okay? Now the subtitles are there, but you're going to be familiar enough with the story that you really don't have to read that much because you're going to know what's going on, all right? So I took about 40 minutes from the movie Passion of the Christ, which came out about 15 years ago, which you can't believe it, and squished it down to about 20, and cut a lot of the stuff out. So if you have young children, just give them their device and let them play with that or whatever. I don't really see any, but in case. So I'm giving a little bit of a disclaimer here, but I was not tarred and feathered after the first service, so I guess it was okay. But it is a little bit not graphic. I've tried to eliminate all that I can, but it is high drama still, okay? Which makes you beg the question, why did it have to be rated R to still be dramatic? Anyway, so it's not R-rated. It's in black and white. That was another thing. Color really adds a lot of, stuff that you don't need. So hopefully you take it for what it was intended to be. This is Lent. It's a time to be a little bit uncomfortable, a time to be a little bit out of our element, and so we'll go with that. Now, just to give you an idea, the opening scene is where Pontius Pilate and his wife are exchanging a little bit of conversation right before they bring Jesus to Pilate, okay?